Hello, everyone, and welcome to How Does the Art World Work? I'm Bartholomew Bland.
I'm Matt Nasser.
I'm Claudia Baez.
And we are joined today with a special guest, Kevin Ritter, who is the managing editor of Urban Omnibus. And today we're going to be talking about his recent article about accessibility in some of New York's major cultural institutions. So we're very excited to get down into your critique of where you think accessibility is working in the arts today and where it needs improvement.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here and speak with you some more today.
Wonderful. So let's get to the beginning of talking about the article. I believe that this originated out of a panel or a conclave, a coming together that the Architectural League was hosting. Is that right?
Yes. So Urban Omnibus is a publication of the Architectural League, and we do kind of prolonged looks at urbanism and issues in New York City, ranging from accessibility to housing to the climate crisis. And so the Architectural League organized a panel in January with JSA Mixed Design, which is an architecture firm helmed by Joel Sanders, to really look at kind of the ways that museums and cultural institutions, especially art museums, are thinking about accessibility in their spaces, especially the kind of non-gallery spaces that really make up the visitor experience. So anything from your entrance to the lobby to bathrooms to the hallways, which people move around from gallery to gallery. So they had a panel discussion in January, which was kind of the impetus for this article. And after the panel, there was a big kind of symposium for museum professionals the next day. And in addition to attending those, I also visited a lot of the museums that are kind of doing this work on a very real day-to-day basis and seeing how and I wanted to see how it was kind of playing out on the ground level. This is something I'm quite experienced in from my career before I was working in this urban planning and journalism space. I worked for a long time on the front lines of many cultures.
The front lines.
Yeah, I guess the front lines. But I in visitor services department, in guest engagement, at various institutions throughout New York City, arts institutions, history museums, performing arts institutions.
The whole gamut.
Real gamut, yeah.
Yes. And so all four of us go regularly. We visit cultural institutions. And so before we get into your analysis of who's doing what and why are they doing a good job, which do you, Matt, think of as the most friendly cultural institutions that you visit?
The most friendly. I mean, reading the article, I was, at the Met recently, and I prefer to go in through the downstairs entrance.
Which is for those, the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Yeah.
And most visitors, particularly tourists, I think, enter through the grand staircase up to the Great Hall, which is very palatial, right, in viewing. And then there's the alternative entrance that's down on the ground level, which is the education. Is that right?
It's the educational. It's an entrance for educational programs and school groups, but also for visitors that have a mobility disability, meaning they can't climb upstairs, which is the only way to access that main sort of entrance.
So it's interesting that you said that you prefer that, because I had never used that entrance until earlier this year, and now I've started using it very regularly. So why do you like it better?
Yeah, I think it is with a lot of the museums in New York, I know your article talks about barriers of, being maybe confusing or getting around. But when you get to know a place, it almost feels like I know the way to go. I know the special way. I know the way to get in. And so that sort of barrier becomes sort of there was a reward when you overcome it as an able person I'm not, but which I enjoy.
There is that return of familiarity, right?
Yeah.
That's the entrance that we use the copyists. We're going through the educational section because we're carrying
all your equipment.
All our equipment. So we're pulling an electrical bag full of oil paint. I always bring a lot of stuff. I don't need it all, but I bring a lot. But yeah, that's a great entrance. Then the only problem that I find with the museum and my copyist experience is that when we're done, we can't go anywhere if you're carrying these things, because to get out, you have to always come back down that way and get
there's
out.
no lockers?
Or else you're going to carry your bag down all those stairs, which
And they don't
you're
make
not gonna do.
don't make accommodations for the copyists who are actually the practicing artists
Not
who are
that
working there?
accommodating, no. I mean, there
So
is
that's
like
very
a
interesting,
checkout.
right?
There's a checking, you can check your coat and stuff like that, but they don't like to check a suitcase and stuff like that.
Right.
It's complicated. So when we go to copy, we can't really actually also go explore the Met. But you're exhausted anyway, so you have to go back another day.
But so your critique of this area that's on the ground level, this educational entrance, how did you? What was your analysis of that compared to the Great Hall?
I mean, I went to a wonderful talk at the Met last summer with Simi Linton, who uses a wheelchair, and she gave a wonderful talk about the Great Hall and the entrance to the Met, kind of talking about like how for many disabled people, there's this like disparate access to like feelings of ascension and beauty. Like to climb the stairs into the Met is this like sort of awe-inspiring experience. You get to feel like you're elevating and going into this really beautiful place. But when you go in the sort of educational entrance, you go through a like low ceilinged hallway that is like next to what used to be the Met's like clearance gift store. And then you enter a like kind of uninspiring room. Like upstairs, there's like flowers that are endowed by a permanent fund. There's no flowers for disabled people at the sort of lower entrance.
Or the children.
Or
right?
the children who have an educational wing there.
You mentioned it, the flowers. I always thought that was one of the most wonderful things about the Met. I think it's Lila Atchison Wallace who endowed that in perpetuity, fresh flowers. And I thought that was such a gracious thing to meet you. I mean, it always seems like someone really cares, that the institution cares in some way. And it's interesting, it isn't replicated at most of the other museums, maybe because I don't have a private endowment for it. But yes, I was sort of reading your article and thinking, well, that's kind of niggling. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, why can't they move some of the flowers down? I think that would be a nice.
Yeah.
If the Met's listening right now, move down a bouquet.
I'm
You're going to push back.
I'm going to push. Well, I'm not going to push back. I mean, this is going to get into like therapy, but I get alienated by that. I'm alienated by grandiose, by flowers, by that. I like the other entrance because it's like, I'm getting to the art. I'm going to my thing. And
many people feel very similarly to you, like both disabled and non-disabled. Like some people prefer the kind of more low-key, less stimulating experience, and others kind of want and appreciate that wow of an entrance. So like, I'm curious about like, how can we have like both things for all people?
Exactly. I can have a choice. Some person can't have a choice.
Well,
it's impossible to please everybody.
It is.
So that's a question. But well, I mean, I think it's interesting to look at the Met and then to look at the Brooklyn Museum, which is a similar Beaux-Arts building in many ways, in which they had a very steep grand staircase that I believe was ripped off the front of it during the Great Depression when it had structural issues. And of course, the Brooklyn Museums, ever since then, you've always entered at the ground level. Then they did I think, rather unfortunate overhaul of their front facade in the 1990s. But you do enter, it's kind of a combination of the two things of the Met. You enter a quite grand space that was originally their basement area, but was opened up. And I think it kind of balances between the grandiose and the more prosaic.
Yeah.
Well, there's also like all these cafeteria options at the Met, and there aren't that many at the Brooklyn Museum. I'm into the cafeteria aspect of museums.
Very important, right?
I think so. I mean, the MoMA is fantastic. MoMA just covers it all, and it works.
Yes. I mean, this speaks to another thing that we're really finding with museums, which is that they're like forever trying to find like new sources of revenue as like exhibitions become more expensive to mount. Like inflation is a very real thing. So we're increasingly seeing, like, ever since the 1980s when like MoMA did its redesign then, like to think about the museum as a space to move people through and also like monetize the experience while they're there. So there's like at the Met, there's like 5 or 6 cafes probably. MoMA, I believe, has 3 at this point. So it's a really kind of, I think, popular way for museums to like generate more revenue for themselves.
Do you think we can talk about your idea for the Bronx Museum? My husband is on the Bronx Museum and they need to make money. And Matt came up with a great idea.
Well, I think they should sell pot. I think I work at La Mama as well, and I think you also wrote about their renovation. I have a lot to talk to you about that. But we funded, I mean, I was not born yet, but La Mama's earlier life was funded by, a lot of their theater companies were funded by selling marijuana. Not legally, but that really was like a lot of downtown theater was funded. Theater of the Ridiculous. I bought my pot from people that were in Hair and Godspell and that sort of thing. And I think now that it's legal and the city is looking for like nonprofits and responsible people to give the licenses to, I think I think museums, theaters, Housing Works has one, and it works very well.
I think perhaps it would come up against the idea of museums as almost kind of a nutritional good, as it were, you know, the educational institution, the place that you bring your family, the place that you bring your children. But I think there would be a perception gap there, but it's an interesting notion.
Yeah. And I don't know. There's lots of studies about how healthy pot is. And it's also many of the artists that made that work were probably stoned to begin with.
Altered realities. Yeah, so maybe they could do a test run in conjunction with an exhibition on altered realities.
Yeah, and it could be evening things, and it can, you know, there's a place for that. But that was an idea to help. I mean, the thing is, it's sort of, you know, to go to the point of, you have these organizations that most of the people hired are there to curate and to run a museum, and then you have the extra thing of accessibility, of marketing to get the word out. I feel like I wonder if you felt this when you were talking to these museums. It felt like there were a lot of excuses of it's too far, the sign's not right, the things like that, and like where's maybe we aren't culturally
relevant.
Everyone
talks frantically about relevance.
Maybe we need to spend the money getting people to have that culture, to have that. I go to museums.
I need to go. I must go.
Yeah, the culture of it is dying.
I mean, I think like almost every museum will look to their exterior as sort of a problem to be solved. And I think there is a tendency to believe that like, if only I had a different sign or a different door, then the people would be rolling in, because people would know we're here and this will like solve all our problems. If we have like a different, maybe more colorful or bigger sign, this will like let our wider community know we're here. But I think it is like much more complicated than that. Like building a space for a wider and more diverse audience isn't solely a signage problem. Like that sort of like external marking can definitely help, but kind of it's like repeated exposure and like repeated communication about what you are and what you do with a broad public that will like build those relationships. And really investing in that continued work is, I think, how to like chart a path forward.
Well, I was at the National Museum Conference, the American Alliance of Museums, which was in Baltimore this year. And I've been the last several years. And you notice there's like a tension between, of course, professional organizations saying museums are great, wonderful, bigger, bolder, faster, further, and an underlying kind of growing, I would say, nervousness and anxiety on the part of arts administrators, that it's really just the culture is changing. The culture of going to a museum is changing. The number of people who are inspired to go to a museum is changing, and whether people's attention is just being drawn in other ways and areas, and that museums may be losing kind of some element of their relevance to the greater population.
Yeah. And I mean, we see this in all sorts of visual arts programming. Like we can now like go see the Van Gogh experience in New York City, which like blows Van Gogh paintings up to like building scale and animates them, but the Met and MoMA are also offering their own Van Gogh experience, which is like based in a sort of materiality, and like is an actual object by Van Gogh.
And the Van Gogh experience is very exciting. I have seen it. I was being a snob about it, and then a cousin of mine had seen it in Miami, and we went down, and it was kind of jaw-dropping. You sort of felt like if Van Gogh lived today, he would be doing digital media. I mean, that's kind of what you
loved it?
I did love it.
I've never done it, so I can't speak for it.
You can't speak to it, but you can just...
I did grow up going to museums.
Mm.
My mother was very much into that, so she dragged us as kids, and it was literally a dragging. It was so hard for us as children. The minute you walked into the museum, somebody knocked you on the head with a hammer. It was just hard. I mean, it's a difficult environment for children, and it's not geared toward children.
No.
And you don't mention the children in your article, but they're not to be running, they're not to be talking, they're not to be yelling, and they can't touch the work. It's like a very difficult place.
Yeah, and they're often like heavily policed in these spaces by the security guards. There's all these ways to be in a museum, which exist for various reasons. Like there are rules because we need to like protect these pieces of art, which are held in trust by these institutions for the good of the public to see and learn from them. So like it is important that we preserve them, but also like these like a lot of rules in museums are also designed to like preserve sorts of social norms around a like quite middle class visitor or even an upper class visitor and their sorts of like expectations about what an experience will be like.
The Frick collection is a good example of that.
You can't use your phone.
But I think most museums have caved in on the phone.
No, you're not caved in.
You can take photos with your phone, but you cannot like take a call.
On the phone.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think it's good. I mean, in the long run, I mean, I love museums, right? I mean, I grew up going through the hardship of going to them, but learning and seeing and knowing and recognizing. The hardship of going
to museums, yes.
But now I enjoy it tremendously. I mean, obviously.
I think like I think the like experience that made me most love museums in my life was I had this job as a teenager. It was like a program to like learn about art, but also like learn about how to have a job. And we like had it in this tent in Cleveland, Ohio, just in the middle of this park. And the park was next to the art museum. And the Cleveland Museum, much to its credit, all of its permanent collection is free. You don't even need a ticket. You can just walk in. And that was the building where we had our bathroom. And so I think the experience of like, we'd be in this like hot outdoor place, and I quite unfortunately for me was placed in the magic group, so I had to learn magic tricks. But this is neither here nor there, because like 2 to 3 times a day I would get to go into the museum just to like use the bathroom. And while I was there, I also like slowly like became familiar with this institution, kind of had a like more like quiet everyday sort of relationship with it and its holdings. They like became familiar to me and more like a friend.
Like which painting? Tell me. I'd like to hear.
I think when I was in high school, I really actually they had this Damien Hirst, which I feel much more complicated about now, but it was one of his pieces that was made of butterflies and like designed to evoke this stained glass window. And it was like formative to be able to like visit it regularly, spend time with it. I mean, there are these like real creatures that once lived. They're like iridescent and colorful and like create this like quite massive piece, and it's like quite beautiful and awe-inspiring, but there's this also like uncomfortableness about these once living creatures being like dead and deceased, and there's something like creepy and morbid about it. one thing I really loved to do around that time was just like sit in that gallery and watch people like get close to it and kind of realize it was made of, and like watching their sort of faces as it turned, as their like understanding of this thing turned. It was like, I think, really special that that space was free to me, that I could go every day, that it was just like a space of my everyday life.
It's so
that's very hard.
interesting how
That's
you
very hard to
describe that.
scale up, right? I mean, that's for repeat. We think about the students who do the field trips. They might go to the museum once a year, or they go every year to a museum and they go to a different one. That's not the same as having that sort of weekly or monthly, even repeat thing where you become the familiarity. The talisman is there.
Yes,
I remember you talking about the Jazz Bowl.
Yes,
at the Cleveland Museum as one of your other kind of fixed points that you would come and visit. And I think we all have that. I mean, that gets back to what you were saying about when you went to the Met and you knew the way. There's the kind of fruits of the repeat visit. I remember so distinctly coming to New York City from Miami, and I was 11 years old, and we went to the Frick. I went with my parents, and they basically, an old docent was like, no, he can't come in. He's not old enough, blah, 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 because the Frick to this day, does not allow children.
Oh, wow.
And the bitterness, the bitter gall that I carried with me. And I remember coming back a few years later, and I was old enough to go in, and I have never yet in these 40 years crossed the path of the Frick without feeling a bit of triumph that, and there's something about delayed gratification. I don't think the Frick is a great museum for small children. It just isn't. I think the kind of work that they have is you need some kind of grounding to fully appreciate it. But I think that's okay. And yet that sort of flies in the face of a lot of questions of accessibility and all of those things.
One of the biggest barriers for museums in our city is not necessarily ramps or signage or anything being the building being unclear. It remains that the Guggenheim, MoMA, the Whitney are all $30 for your average person to visit. And that is people would have to work a minimum wage worker has to work over 2 hours to afford that. I mean, all of these institutions offer some sort of free hours, but MoMA's is once a month on Friday evenings. The Guggenheim is an hour and a half at the end of Mondays and Saturdays. And
you've talked about they're packed, right? I mean, we know that from experience that these very limited free hours there's clearly a hunger there. And
you go,
fee is a barrier, right?
It's a barrier. People are really hungry and excited to experience these institutions. And you go to these free hours. If you go to the Guggenheim, the line is snaking around the block. So it's not as if kind of average everyday people. It's a very different experience to go in these hours as opposed to the paid hours, which also may be crowded, but are generally more relaxed and enjoyable times to visit. So.
Well, there is a capacity to these museums as well. So, I mean, if they were free, the Guggenheim, for example, if it was free,
it's just not that large of a facility.
It would be a large playground. Yeah. Lots of kids would love to go there just to run in those ramps.
I mean, and also what an exciting way to think of that museum. What a
it's a fun museum. I don't need a wheelchair in that one.
No, but how exciting to think about that space as a space of spontaneity and play, which is not how they normally feel. And the Guggenheim is also an interesting way to think about accessibility. It has some problems with its bathrooms and various spaces for people with mobility disabilities. It's also quite loud and echoey, so that can be a problem for people with cognitive disabilities. But it's a 6-foot ramp, and it's how exciting to think about radical new possibilities for how we can design our spaces for other sorts of users.
Yeah, it's not every day that we can find Frank Lloyd Wright.
Well, you talked about in your article the frozen in time quality of certain architecturally significant buildings like the Guggenheim, the Frank Lloyd Wright building, the Cooper Hewitt, Carnegie's mansion, which they're only going to do a limited number of interventions to sort of keep the fabric of the thing. And so maybe some of this is about new, more radical things. I was interested in the Queens Museum, which has had, a huge overhaul in the last few years in terms of construction, and yet is still kind of stymied by its location in the middle of a park that doesn't have easy access, no matter how friendly they make it or transparent they make it. It's difficult to access through public transportation.
Yeah, it's they're in the middle of this like beautiful park, which is Flushing Corona Park in Queens, which is like a wonderful space to be in. It's right by the Unisphere, which is this fountain with the globe, but it's like 15-minute walk from public transportation. It's like surrounded by highways that are not easy to cross on foot. So I think an institution like that has a real sort of struggle to find good ways to get the public to their doors.
Can I ask you something else different? Are you a writer?
I am a writer.
And you write only about art?
I write about cities. I kind of came up in the cultural industry. Then I went to urban planning school, and now I kind of write about cities and streets, and also kind of the role of cultural institutions within our sort of urban fabric. So
Got it. And how do you meet Bart?
We just became friends about 10 years ago.
And we've done a lot of museum visits.
Yeah.
And we've had a lot of shared cultural
And how does the art world work?
I mean, that's tricky, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of art worlds, aren't there? Like, there's the art world of like art fairs and galleries, which like is a sort of model where like many artists work very hard and attempt to sell their works to a sort of dwindling consumer base for like pretty high ticket prices. And I think that's one sort of segment of the art world. I think that's related but different from this world we're talking about today, which is this world of museums and sort of nonprofit galleries of a certain like budget, which are like show some of that same work, but they conceptualize themselves as having a real sort of duty to the public, but also like often are caught up in these same sorts of like patterns of capital accumulation that you see with a collector class. And then like there is also this sort of like everyday sort of art making that like everyday people do on their own, like people who make art for themselves, like is like people making like work for their like churches, like Christmas tree. That's like a form of art making, but it's not the art world that we normally talk about. But I don't know if I can answer that question.
It was very good. What were you going to ask him about the La Mama?
Oh, I reading the article, I came to realize. So I've worked at La Mama for a long time, and before that renovation, I was against it. Mm-hmm. I was against the renovation because I'd been there long enough to know that people complain about almost everything at La Mama except the spaces. The spaces were these magical spaces from the 60s, these black box theaters that you can't really find very much in New York City. And at that time it was proposed, like I think it was like around 20 to 22 million, wound up being $2 or $3 million more than that, and as these things are. And I was upset because it turned the building into a place where there was 3 really good functioning theaters to like 1.5 theaters, mm-hmm. because of bringing it up to code for an elevator, 2 stairwells, the space you need for these bathrooms, the space you need for all these things. So now we have one theater that is kind of like a big room that's sort of nice. It's not greatly functional for a black box theater. And then we have like the community, which is a community space, which is like a room. And I'm like, okay, we made it accessible to everyone can come to these places, which wasn't possible before. But I made the joke, which was a not sensitive joke of like, for $23 million, you can hire us, because this is what we were doing before, literally carrying Ellen up to her apartment. You can hire us to carry anybody that needs to go to these theaters. Because what happened now at La Mama, and we're going back to your point about making these places accessible monetary wise, is now they're in terrible debt from this renovation. They've closed their visual arts space because they can't afford to open that. And they have, in my opinion, diminished spaces for the art and the mission that they're trying to make. So I don't know. I mean, like, to that, I would like say, like, it's very hard to love a space you can't get into. So I'm sure there's like plenty of people who like would have loved those spaces who couldn't be there, and also plenty of like artists who like are making like interesting work that could not access those spaces. And like I think there is like there's something so touching about those stories of like carrying Ellen up those stairs in that chair. But like also that's like not a realistic like access solution for like many people. Like anyone using a power wheelchair, that's like actually not accessible. It's not acceptable and incredibly dangerous for them. So I think it is like important for an institution like Mamama to be like doing this work and thinking about how to like build spaces for disabled people as it is for all people. Though like this work is like that sort of physical renovation, as you point out, is like incredibly capital intensive and like can kind of put institutions in a dangerous like financial spot later on. And like realistically, the answer is like we need better financial systems to support this work, which is like important to our community. Yeah, this is the richest country. Yeah. This is the richest country in the world. This is the richest city in this country, and all of our arts organizations are in trouble. How much? Where can we go from here? Like.
Is that the cliffhanger for this episode? Where can we go from here?
How does the artwork world work? Not very well.
Oh, no. Well, that's, yes.
Agreed.
We'll see. Yeah. Agreed. No, there are many things to be optimistic about. I think part of it is also the question of professionalization. I mean, La Mama, like many places, they start as these very grassroots things, people doing stuff out of their garage, people doing stuff out of their apartment. And as they age, they move into a kind of a push towards bureaucracy, push towards professionalization. And that's just kind of the sort of life cycle in some way of arts organizations. You always see it. And then that's why you need to have new, fresh people sort of in their garage being like, all right, let's just do it without a board of directors. Let's just do it without a state grant. Let's just do it because we can.
And my point was, from reading your article, my argument was not valid. And I thought, no, it needs to be accessible.
Yeah, I think
it needs to be accessible. And where they faulted was, I think, just budget and what the need of theater making is.
Yes.
Wasn't thought out as much in that thing. It looks beautiful.
Yeah.
It's not so much as functional, but it did absolutely need to be something where, you know, what I really realized from your article is like, it shouldn't be like, oh, there's your entrance and there's my entrance. It's everyone is at this entrance. So there's not it's not you're an exception. You need this. We can all go up a ramp. We can all use that space in the bathroom. We can all, and we don't have to like single people out for anything. We can make it accessible for everyone. And I think that is helpful in design, that I don't see the elevator that goes up one flight for the wheelchair. It can be something that's organic for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, there's no solution that will be appropriate for everyone. Universal design is something that gets bandied about a lot in the architectural space, and that's realistically an impossibility. But I think designing spaces with the communities we're seeking to serve, also listening to them and working with them to co-design is also I think a key part of any sort of design process for these institutions. So if you're a theater like Mamama, it's not just about getting a ramp or an elevator. It's also about building a community of disabled artists, of the artists who are in your neighborhood, and imagining what kind of space they need to do the work that they want to do.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of How Does the Art World Work? I think this is a perspective we haven't had yet on the podcast, so we appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.